Anybody who lives in Mount Airy has heard a little bit about the Civil War history. Um, Maryland and in particular Mount Airy had a lot of involvement in the war, despite what everybody may think. What I'm going to cover tonight is just the year 1862. The topic, believe it or not, is so big. There's so many things that occurred here during the war that I would never get you out of here around 8 o'clock if I didn't shut it off at 1862. So that's where I'm going to quit. If you have anything to add, feel free to chime in. Wayne and Rodney and Larry and I have been doing research now for probably over a year. Yeah, Wayne's been doing a lot of graveyard searching for veterans, and there are a lot of veterans around here.
That doesn't sound right.
Great ghost
Ghost tours.
Both north and south. As was Maryland, this area was a very divided area. It had a lot of pro-Union and a lot of pro-Confederacy people around here. And needless to say, the pro-Confederacy people tried to do a lot of damage in order to shut down the pro-Union people. And there's a lot of, when you go through the papers and things, you'll see all kinds of references to the fact that this guy got arrested as being a spy. This guy was released from prison because he was arrested for being a sympathizer and blah, blah, blah. So, but one of the things they did do is they highly impacted the railroad, which was one of the major Union assets. Without it, they probably couldn't have won the war. So it really influenced what happened around here. And needless to say, if you know anything about the B&O Railroad, it starts up here in Baltimore near the port of Baltimore, which is important because Baltimore at the time was one of the major port cities in the United States, right up there with New York. So, so a lot of products, a lot of materials came into Baltimore and were immediately shipped west on the B&O Railroad. And of course, at that particular time, the B&O Railroad came through this place called Mount Airy. And needless to say, the reason that Mount Airy was such a hot spot during the Civil War is because it sat right on that railroad. During the war, the Confederate sympathizers, the Confederate cavalry, the guerrilla units spent a lot of time going up and down the railroad, tearing up track, cutting telegraph lines, and making a general nuisance of themselves. But the big thing was they were stopping the traffic flow going from Baltimore out west and from out west into Baltimore itself. So just a couple things I want to point out on here. Mount Airy's right in here. Plane 1, if you know anything about the early years of the B&O Railroad, you know that there were 4 planes that went through Mount Airy to get the trains over Pars Ridge. Pars Ridge was a major obstacle. It was 880 feet where the railroad crossed, and at the time, in the earliest days, the trains were pulled by horses, and in order to get those trains over the Pars Ridge, they actually unloaded the passengers and carried them in wagons up to the other side and reloaded them. Same thing with the freight. So but there were, along here, you'll see plane 1 on this side, plane 4 on this side. Those developed into little communities at the time, and the reason they did is because they, in the early days when they were still using horses, they had to have a place to stable the horses that assisted trains over the mountain, or over the ridge anyway. So Plane 1 was developed into a community where they must have had sightings, because when you read all the telegraph messages going back and forth between Harper's Ferry and Mount Airy and some of the other towns along the railroad, you'd see that Plane 1 was mentioned numerous times, where they had stored rolling stock and locomotives. And Plane 4 was the same way. Plane 4 was a place where, when the trains approached from the west, they would attach another locomotive to the train, and two locomotives would pull the trains over the ridge. So those two places, besides Mount Airy, were used to as sidings, so to speak, for the trains, so they could put on other cars, take off cars to get them over the mountain, and to put on new locomotives. So, but anyway, so this here, all along this line, all the way from down in Ellicott City and beyond, all the way up into Monocacy Junction, which is right here, right from the beginning of the war, the Federals brought Union regiments up to guard the railroad. And despite what you've heard, everybody knows that if you've read the Blue Book or the B&O story book, you'll know that the 14th New Jersey Regiment, Company K, was stationed here in Mount Airy to guard the railroad. Well, they were one of many that were here. In fact, they were one of the shortest ones, duration-wise, that stayed here. They were all up and down the railroad, but here in Mount Airy, they were only here a couple of months, few months. Whereas there was a regiment from Delaware, there were several regiments from Maryland that were in this town longer than the 14th New Jersey. I don't know why it is that they got so much notoriety, but somehow they did. So anyway, as I said, from as early as January of 1862, different regiments were stationed in this town to guard the railroad, but not just the railroad. If you look back at this map for a minute, you'll see right here, there's a major highway. It was called the National Pike in those days. In our time, it's called Maryland Route 144. But in those days, this was the major road from the east to the west, to the Ohio country, and it had been there for years. So that was another reason the Federals stationed troops along this way, was to guard that road. They did not want the travel from Baltimore interrupted, a lot because there were troop movements up and down this road all the time. Another thing, and it's not really shown on this map, but there is a road that goes from Washington up to Westminster and beyond. And there's also a road over here that goes up through Ridgeville and Mount Airy up to Westminster. Today we call it Route 27. In those days it was called either the Westminster Road or the Ridge Road. And this other road over this way is called the Washington Road. And we now know it as Georgia Avenue or Route 97. So there were two major north-south roads near here, one going right through town, and there was one major east-west road going through here, and that was the National Pike. So all those roads carried troops to various places in this area. And in particular, out this way, when you get out to where Harper's Ferry is, it's a little off the map, but out this way is what they call Maryland Heights. And the Federal Army had troops there stationed all during the war because it was a high overlook, looked over Harper's Ferry and helped to protect Harper's Ferry, although Harper's Ferry was one of the most vulnerable places in the whole country at the time. Why anybody would station troops there is beyond me, but in order to help protect it, there were constantly troops going to Maryland Heights. So these are the reasons why Mount Airy was such an important place in those days. The railroad obviously was the big one. The Washington Road and what was called the Westminster Road, and of course the National Pike. All major thoroughfares carrying people and goods north, south, east, and west. So like I said, as early as January of 1862. Now, as you know, the Fort Sumter was back in the 1861 period. Virginia seceded in 1861, and Maryland, believe it or not, held a secession, the state legislature held a secession Congress in 1861, it was in April of 1861, and voted overwhelmingly not to secede from the Union. But it wasn't because they were strong advocates of the North. In fact, it was just the opposite. The reason that Maryland chose not to secede from the Union was because the North had already started blockading Norfolk, Charleston, and all the major ports of the South. And Baltimore did not want their port to be blockaded by the Northern Army or the Northern Navy. So they went ahead just for a business reason. For money, they decided they were going to stay in the North. However, an interesting fact, when Maryland chose not to secede, they also chose to tell the North to keep their soldiers out of the state of Maryland. They were not going to support the North fighting against their southern neighbors. So after the riots in Baltimore, the governor of Baltimore immediately sent the militia north to burn the bridges, all the railroad bridges into Baltimore, so that the Northern Army could not use the railroad through Maryland to get down south and fight the rest of the southern states. So, like I said, there was a lot more going on in Maryland than people are aware. But anyway, in January, Company I of the 10th Maine Regiment was stationed in Mount Airy from January to March to overlook and to guard the railroad in Mount Airy and the National Road. When they got up and left in March, they went to Harper's Ferry, and right away, the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment, which is called the Potomac Home Guard Brigade, was brought into Mount Airy to guard the railroad and the National Road. And they were here from March of 1862 until it was like 2 or 3 months later, they got sent out to Maryland Heights to look over that place. But the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment, the Potomac Home Brigade, was here on a number of occasions, different companies of it. And they were also up at Monocacy Junction and a few other places. So, right from the very beginning of the war, there were troops stationed here in Mount Airy. So, and the reason being is, again, there were a lot of cavalry raids and guerrilla unit raids into Mount Airy to tear up the railroad. Mount Airy, Monrovia, Imesville, all up and down. Hood's Mill was another place that was hit. Sykesville was hit later on by Jeb Stewart. One of the things we found doing our research was a number of newspaper articles talking about different instances of rebel incursions into the area, as they called it, rebels. But as I said before, Maryland was a very divided state. It turns out, if you look at the numbers, there were at least 2 times as many men who joined the Union Army as there were who joined the Confederate Army. And in this area, it's pretty much the same. If you go down through in 1890, a census was taken. They take them every 10 years. The 1890 census in general was lost due to a fire out in, I think it was in St. Louis, but wherever it was, it burned the majority of the 1890 census. But the one piece that was saved, because it wasn't in that fire, was what they call the veterans schedule. The veterans schedule, every man who fought in the Civil War, or at least everyone that was fought on the Union side, was listed. It told when he enlisted and where he was stationed, what units he was in, and that was like I said, safe. But the interesting thing about it is, they were not supposed to write down the names of Confederates in that census. However, somebody didn't tell the census takers, and a lot of the Southern boys who fought in the war were also listed there. And that's where we got a lot of the information we got in terms of who the veterans from this area were. But if you go through it, like I said, there were probably 2 times more men who joined the Union Army as there were the Confederate Army. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the Southern Army couldn't draft anybody from Maryland. However, the Northerners, the federal government drafted a lot of Marylanders into the Army, black and white. They had what they call the U.S. colored troops, and a lot of the free black men from this area were also drafted, and they were drafted into the U.S. colored troops. So, but this article here, as it explains, right down the road between here and Damascus, probably, I think it says there was like 100 or 200, I forget exactly, men who camped down there in the woods not too far from here, who were on their way to Virginia to join the Confederate Army. And if you go back and you read some of the stories and some of the regimental histories, there were a lot of men from Maryland, in particular Baltimore, who rode up through here along the National Road trying to get across the Potomac River and join the Confederate Army. And this is one of those instances. They weren't really Confederate soldiers, although it says rebel camps. They were men who were organized to join the Confederate Army, but hadn't actually been joined into the Confederate Army. And they caused quite a stir because everybody was all in a fit about any time there were guerrillas or cavalry in this area. it caused quite the disturbance. Good and bad. Yes.
Mike, I'm just curious, I'm looking at this article, it says there's about 150 of them. It says on Saturday, they were camped 3 miles south of Mount Airy in a dense and secluded woods. I'm kinda curious where that all is.
Oh, I
And
am
then it says on Saturday, they moved to Claggett's Woods.
Claggetsville, yeah.
Claggett's Woods.
Oh, yeah, Claggett's Woods, yeah.
Yeah, is anybody curious? I've never heard of Claggett's Woods.
Claggetsville,
You've heard of
yeah,
Claggetsville?
it's in between here and Damascus.
You know
Where
where
he
he
comes
goes
in,
off.
yeah.
Okay.
That's Claggetsville.
It's right there where the church is.
Oh, where they meet? Okay,
Mhm.
all right, so you think,
Used to be a store right there if you go up a little bit, I think it's what is it, a chimney place
Right.
there down?
It doesn't, it's not there right now.
Yeah.
It's a landscaping company, but yeah, there's.
Yeah, but there, that
Oh, I know
is
what
the
you're
gas
talking
station
about.
store.
yeah,
Right, and there was another church building.
John Deere.
Yeah,
It's across.
Yeah,
the
so,
street.
yeah, you're in the area.
Right.
That's,
that's,
yeah.
okay, so
That's
that's
a
the
new-
Claggett, that's, all right, didn't
New thing in
know,
Claggetsville.
that was what that was called. I noticed they called them gorillas in there,
That's what the locals call it.
probably because they hadn't joined the army yet, maybe.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, Mike, that's my question is, do the people who were doing the damage, were they locals or were they coming from Virginia and places like that to do the
The
damage?
ones who did the most damage were cavalry. They were actually, believe it or not, the majority of the raids were run by a man named Billy Dorsey. That man
Cat Bill.
was
Bad
something
news.
else. He should have a book written about him. He is just amazing. But he really didn't come into the picture till the year after. 1863, he made an appearance in this town dozens of times. And he had people all kinds of upset. But I was gonna cover that when I cover 1863. But anyway, he's a very interesting character. There are some wild stories about him. And his name was William Henry Buzzard Dorsey. And
Henry's
as the,
grandson.
yes, he was Henry Dorsey, or Henry Buzzard's grandson. And needless to say, he was part of the Buzzard family, which is all through everybody who's from this area. All right, so in that same article from the Baltimore Sun on August 21st, this is one of the ones I was talking about earlier. There were several men taken prisoner. You got to understand, one of the things Abraham Lincoln did when the Southern states started seceding from the Union, he was desperately trying to keep Maryland in the Union. By hook or by crook, he didn't care. So one of the things he did was suspended the writ of habeas corpus. I'm no lawyer, you can tell us better than I can, but habeas corpus is basically you couldn't be held in prison without being charged and without a trial eventually. Well, when he suspended that right, the northern government started arresting people left and right. If you were considered to be a sympathizer of the South, you were going to get arrested and thrown in jail. And a lot of Marylanders were thrown in Fort McHenry. And that's where they were imprisoned for, not for the whole duration of the war, but for quite a while. And later on, a lot of Marylanders who they suspected as collaborating were actually sent down to Point Lookout, which was one of the most notorious prisons, POW camps in this country. A lot of men died there. A lot of men and women died down there. But anyway, this particular one, it talks about a bunch of people who were released from prisoners. They were taken in Frederick City. They were taken, and amongst those was Gasaway Grimes, Wellington Hammond, Samuel Baker, all from Ridgeville. Again, because they were thought to be either spies or collaborators or even guerrillas. So this just talks about how they were released. Why they were released, I couldn't tell you. Probably because they couldn't prove they did anything wrong. But those are names you may recognize, Grimes and Baker in particular. All right. Now we're going to start to get into what is commonly known as the Maryland Campaign. Everybody's heard of the Battle of Sharpsburg or Antietam, depending on how you look at history. But the Maryland Campaign was, as I'll explain in a minute, but you look at the slide, and the lead up to the Maryland Campaign was a number of defeats of the Union Army, major defeats of the Union Army. In July of 1862, during that spring and summer of 1862, George B. McClellan, he was in charge of the Union Army, and it was this was a huge army. This was like 120,000 men. It was not a small army. He was down he had taken all those troops out of Washington, went down to Chesapeake Bay on ships and moved into Fort Monroe and then across over onto the peninsula in Virginia between the James River and the York River. He marched up the river. His goal was to take Richmond and, as a result, end the war. Well, he didn't do so well. If you know anything about Civil War history, he got on the peninsula and he moved up pretty quickly, although McClellan had the reputation for dragging his feet, for being very slow. He was the most timid of the generals during the Civil War. But in July of 1862, during what they called the 7 Days Battle, General Lee soundly defeated. It cost him a lot of soldiers, but General Lee soundly defeated this overwhelmingly bigger army. Lee had maybe 60,000 troops with him, and like I said, McClellan had over 100,000, and he just whipped McClellan easily, mainly because of McClellan's timidity. McClellan always thought that Lee had an army of close to 150,000 soldiers, and Lee never, during the whole war, he never had 150,000 soldiers. But anyway, so in July 1862, after the 7 Days Battle, at what they called Malvern Hill, again, Lee was whipped badly at Malvern Hill, but McClellan retreated after that battle to the river, to the James River, so that he could get his troops out of Virginia. Well, Lee saw an opportunity. In August of 1862, this other general, Major General John Pope, was given command of what they called the Army of Virginia, and the Army of Virginia was assigned to guard Washington, to get the Confederates out of the Shenandoah Valley, because the Confederates in the valley were a threat to Washington, and he was also supposed to defeat any of the smaller regiments that were still hanging around in northern Virginia. Well, once Lee beat General McClellan down in the peninsula, he immediately sent his army north to defeat Pope, because Pope was sitting basically in the rear of Lee, and that was not a good place to have an enemy army. So in August of 1862, they met at Manassas. And if you know anything about Civil War history, Manassas had already seen one major battle, the first battle of the Civil War, first major battle of the Civil War.
Mike, you a Southerner?
What's that?
I said you a Southern sympathizer?
What's that?
Because you're using the Southern term.
Oh, I know. It's called Bull
All
Run.
Southerners say Manassas, we Northerners say Bull Run.
The answer is yes. My family's from Virginia, North Carolina.
There's the war of northern aggression then.
But anyway, so in August, he beat Pope and sent all those troops up into Washington. So now McClellan had retreated off the peninsula into Washington, and Pope had retreated out of Northern Virginia into Washington. And they were there basically hiding from Robert E. Lee and his army. Well, Lee saw a great opportunity, and that's what this thing called the Maryland campaign is all about. In September, Lee moved north into Leesburg. On September 3rd, he moved up to Leesburg, and with about 65,000 men, he started crossing the Potomac on September 4th. And because the Union Army was all cowering behind the fortifications of Washington, they didn't know where Lee was. They knew he was on the move, but they had no idea where he was going. And if you read the paper, the articles in the paper, there was speculation that he was moving on Philadelphia, he was moving on Gettysburg, he was moving on, you name it. There was even talk about him moving into Pittsburgh and things of that nature. But they had no idea where he was going. And his intention on September 4th, actually on September 3rd when he came up to Leesburg, was to go into Maryland, and just because of his presence, he was hoping that he would draw a lot of the Confederate sympathizers into the army and possibly even get the state of Maryland to secede from the Union finally. But also, and probably more important than anything, he was trying to get the Northern Army out of Virginia. The Northern Army, ever since the war started, and this is, like I said, back in 1861, ever since the war started, the Union Army was in Virginia fighting, and all the activity, all the troop movements were in Virginia. And of course, as a result, when you've got hundreds of thousands of men running around in your state, there's nothing left. The fence posts, the trees, all the food, everything, the horses, all of it's gone because the army's picked it clean. So he was trying to get the Union Army out of Virginia to give Virginia a break, but also, like I said, to try and convince Maryland to come into the fold. And as it turned out, like I said, Maryland was not going to join the South, or was not going to secede, because they had too much to lose. But when they came north, when this army of Lee came north, they were in the worst state they had been during the entire war, and that's all the way up to the end. They had They had no shoes, they had barely had clothing, believe it or not. They had very little food to eat. They had been on the march ever since they were down in July on the peninsula, and they marched north to defeat Pope, and then they marched further north to Leesburg, and they were basically, what they had was what they were carrying on their back. So they needed everything. They needed food, they needed clothing, they needed shoes in particular, they needed horses, they needed all kinds of things. So they came north with strict orders, I might add, that they were not to take anything. Now, what they did do is they purchased it with Confederate money, which you may as well have stolen it, but when they came north, they actually wrote receipts for everything they took, so that hopefully the merchants in Maryland would be reimbursed. Didn't happen, but so on September 4th, like I said, they started crossing the Potomac, and they were crossing the Potomac all from Leesburg all the way up toward Point of Rocks. The one unit in particular that we're interested in for the rest of this discussion is Stuart's cavalry, and in particular Fitzhugh Lee's brigade of Stuart's cavalry. So on September 5th, Lee and Wade Hampton crossed the Potomac into Poolesville, and there was a fairly major battle going on in that area because of Sugarloaf Mountain. If you've ever been to Sugarloaf Mountain, the views from there are spectacular. But in those days, it was not covered in trees like it is today. So the views, you could see from Sugarloaf Mountain, you could see all the way down to Washington on a clear day. So it was a very, very, very strategic location because you could see everything. You could look up and down the Potomac River from Harper's Ferry all the way down to probably Georgetown on a clear day, of course, and see what was going on. And Lee's intent was, he wanted to get there was a flag waving station, a signal corps station on top of Sugarloaf Mountain. And he wanted to get them off the mountain so that he could make sure that they didn't tell the rest of the army that he was up there. So one of his first endeavors was to send the cavalry up to Sugarloaf and take the mountain and that signal corps station so that they couldn't broadcast his invasion. And as it turns out, the Federals on several occasions tried to take it back, and it wasn't for almost, they took it on the 5th or on the 6th, and it wasn't until like the 12th when they finally took it back. So it was quite a while, and it gave Lee the chance to move all the way into Frederick and then cross back over toward Harper's Ferry with his army before the Union Army even knew where he was. And again, if you read the newspaper articles, there were stories about him moving toward Baltimore, Philadelphia, all over the place. They had no idea where he was and what he was doing. And they had no idea that he had recrossed the river. And it wasn't until his lost orders were found, which was also on the 12th, that McClellan finally figured out what he was up to. Right, so this is a map showing the crossing. This is Fitzlee here, Fitzhugh Lee, and this is Hampton coming up here into Poolesville. And later on, they would ride north up into Ridgeville, or up toward Ridgeville. This is after they took the Sugarloaf Mountain. But this is why I talk mostly about Fitz Lee, because he was the one who was actually stationed up here. And all the activity that you hear about through the newspaper articles, through the different reports and the orders that were given, all concern the movement against Fitz Lee. This is another map. If you were at the lecture that was given by the ranger from Monocacy, this is one of the maps he used. But this shows on September 6th the disposition of the cavalry units that the night of the 6th. And as you can see, all these units up here, that's Fitz Lee's regiments, and all this down here is Wade Hampton's regiments. So their job, they moved up Pars Ridge, which, we all know is right along the Ridge Road. And that Pars Ridge goes all the way up into Pennsylvania and goes all the way down and pretty much ends at Sugarloaf Mountain. So it ends right around the Potomac. But this is showing their disposition on September 6th. And this is the National Road. Ridgeville's here, New Market's here, Frederick's all the way back up here. Fitz Lee's headquarters was actually in New Market, and Stewart was right down in Urbana. General Stewart, who was in charge of all the Confederate cavalry, was in Urbana, and that was where his headquarters was. And again, if you read the stories, it's amazing. You would never even know there was a war going on. Stewart moved into Urbana, and he had assigned all his cavalry regiments to send out pickets and watch for the Union Army. Again, Lee assumed that McClellan was going to stay in Washington and not do anything. He also assumed that nobody was going to know he was moving up north. So, he just moved all his troops, thinking that nobody was going to do anything about it. Well, McClellan found out pretty early in the game that Lee was on the move and that he was in Maryland. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, because you had people, as soon as they saw Confederates, all the Union sympathizers were skedaddling. And again, there's newspaper articles. I didn't put all these things there. It would have taken forever, but those people that were Union sympathizers all bagged it. Some of them went to Pennsylvania, some of them went to Ellicott City, some of them went into Washington. And the ones that went into Washington started talking about the massive Confederate army that was invading the North. So on the night of the 6th, that's the way it was. And you can see down here is Washington, and McClellan's starting to send his army north, probing, trying to figure out where Lee's gone to. He sent troops up every major road out of Washington. So the Washington Road that we talked about, 97 or Georgia Avenue, New Hampshire Avenue, which is 605 or whatever now. All those roads were being covered by the Union Army. And of course there was cavalry out in front of them. And one of the big ones, there was the 6th New York, the 8th Pennsylvania, and there was a regiment from Indiana also that were out in the lead. And those are the ones that later on, I think, and I haven't quite gotten to the bottom of it, but I think they're the ones who actually engaged Fitzlee up around Mount Airy and Newmarket. So I better hurry up because we're running out of time. This is one of the stories that talks about people leaving Frederick. Lee moved into Frederick on the 6th of, it was the 6th of September. And he actually sent his men into Frederick, but they were actually encamped south of Frederick, down around Monocacy Junction down that way. They never were encamped up in Frederick, but they did spend a lot of time there. And this talks about a reporter comes into Ellicott Mills, and when he arrives, he's running into people who are in a panic fleeing out of Frederick. So somehow they've made it from Frederick into Ellicott City. And they're talking about this Confederate army that's invaded Maryland. This is a continuation of that article. And in here, they're talking about how, and you can see this in a lot of the telegrams also from the B&O Railroad, but this one here is talking about how all the trains were warned that as they moved west, nobody knew where, again, they had no idea where the Confederate Army was. So they were warned to keep watch as they moved west for any Confederate pickets and things, so that, because they didn't want to lose the trains. And eventually, I don't know if I have any, I put this in here because I thought it would be interesting. The 14th New Jersey was actually up in near Frederick. They were in Monocacy Junction guarding the railroad. And when the Confederate Army moved into Monocacy Junction, they bagged it. It was only part of the 14th New Jersey. It wasn't even the whole regiment. So a company back in those days consisted of maybe 100 men. So if I recall right, there were 4 or 5 companies up there. So we're only talking maybe 400 or 500 men at the most. And Lee's army of about, probably in the neighborhood of 60,000 at the time, was marching toward them, and they hit the road. They were out of there. So, but the 14th New Jersey, like I said, this is 1862. They're still not in Mount Airy. Finally, the train that this reporter was on moved into Mount Airy, and they talk about Mount Airy a lot in terms of the train stopping there and people getting out. But in this particular one, they're talking about how they were carrying passengers who wanted to go up to Monrovia, and they stopped, and they were told to stop in Mount Airy, but the engineer said, the heck with it, and they went all the way to Monrovia, let those people off, and then took off and headed back toward Baltimore. And then, like the bottom part says, all the way down at the end, the Confederate, Fitzhugh Lee, made his headquarters in Newmarket, and all their wagons were moving up into Newmarket. And somehow the reporter caught wind of that also. This here is the 10th. Like I said, the Confederates moved into Frederick on the 6th. But this picture was taken as the Confederates are leaving Frederick and heading out toward Harper's Ferry and Boonesboro and whatnot. But I just thought I'd throw this picture in because this is an actual picture on, as it says here, North Market Street. They're marching out of town on North Market. And it's one of the very few pictures that was taken during the Civil War of troops in Frederick. Okay, so this map's showing the disposition of the Confederate Army during the Maryland campaign. As I said, they're south of Frederick, down near Monocacy Junction. And you can see right here, the railroad's coming up, hits the junction there, and then heads down toward Point of Rocks down that way. Oops. Now, I'm not going to bore you with this, but Stuart's cavalry was divided into 3 divisions, 3 cavalry brigades. You had Fitzhugh, you had Wade Hampton, and you had another general, Beverly Robertson. And then you also had some horse artillery. And they were, the troops in particular from Fitzhugh and some of the batteries out of this horse artillery were actually involved in some skirmishes up this way. All right, so this is the night of the 9th of September. And again, you can see the Ridgeville is here, and you can see the Union Army is approaching, and there's cavalry units all the way up along Pars Ridge now on the 9th of September, opposed by Fitzhugh up here on the National Road and Wade Hampton down this way. And that's this way here is, what is it, 85 that comes down to 27. All right, so that's Fitzlee's brigade. And all these regiments here were part of that, and they were mentioned a number of times in different reports from both north and south. And like I put down here just a little, give you an idea, a brigade was about 800 men. Really, the Confederate cavalry was always very short, and as it, you see, look down here, it says between 160 and 360. There were never a lot, they just never had a lot of troops, and there were a lot of reasons for that. The Confederate cavalry, the men in the cavalry supplied their own horses. And if you got your horse shot out from you, which happened a lot, you had to go find another horse. And so the whole time you were looking for a horse, you were out of action. And so the numbers, whereas they may have been supposedly at 800, were never that high. Even in the Northern Army, you never had 800 men in a regiment because of the same reason. They didn't have horses, or they didn't have arms, or whatnot, because they were in battle. And you also, of course, had casualties. The big thing that I wanted to bring up was, this is a newspaper article, and it talks about a severe skirmish that took place in the neighborhood of Mount Airy. Now, when I first moved here, way back 30 some odd years ago, I was told that there was a cavalry skirmish in where the parking lot of Food Line is. At the time it wasn't Food Line, but I was told there's a cavalry skirmish there. And I never ever found anything that ever referred to it until I saw this newspaper article. And this newspaper article says there were 1,500 Northerners and 1,500 Southerners with artillery involved in this skirmish. Now, to me, 3,000 men is not a skirmish, that's a battle. But that's what the newspaper called it. It says 10 Union soldiers were killed and a number wounded. The only record I found, even other than this newspaper article, is there was a battle, a skirmish of Union and Confederate cavalry up near what's called Monocacy Church. And I had no clue where that was. So I looked it up on Google, and Monocacy Church is, if you're going up Interstate 70, you come to the Inesville exit, 144, where 144 crosses Interstate 70. And there was a skirmish there that I read about in a couple different reports from different cavalry units. So could that have been the one that this newspaper article was talking about? I don't know. I'm still doing a lot of research. I'm supposed to go back down to Smithsonian and take a look down there and look through the Pennsylvania and New York cavalry records to see what they say. But anyway, I thought it was interesting when I found this, that this could have been the one I heard about it at the Food Lion parking lot. And again, this is the night of the 10th, and as you can see, the Union cavalry's lined up along here. Part of this is the 8th Pennsylvania, part of this is the 6th New York, and over here is Fitz-Lee. And again, his headquarters was in Newmarket, which is right there, but he had 4 units all the way up to Pars Ridge. The whole time that they were in Newmarket, he had men up toward Pars Ridge, keeping an eye to make sure the cavalry didn't sneak up on them. So this is anyway. This is just talking about some of the disposition of the troops. But on the 11th, and if you read that article, that whole article about the battle near Mount Airy, they talk about how after the skirmish, the Confederate Army, the Confederate cavalry left and moved north to Liberty Town. The reason they moved north to Liberty Town, of course, was mainly because the whole 9th Corps, and the 9th Corps was maybe 12,000 men, was approaching Pars Ridge at the time. And so a cavalry unit with maybe 500 or 600 men wasn't going to do much against 12,000 Union soldiers. So they headed to Liberty Town, and the reason was Stuart had ordered them to try and get behind the 12th Corps and find out what was going on, find out if there were any other troops behind them, and find out where they were, what their intentions were. They never did get beyond Liberty Town because the Union cavalry dogged them the whole way up there and kept them from getting around the back of the Union Army. But that was pretty much it. After they left, here's where they are up in Uniontown. A brigade from Hampton's regiment actually went all the way up in Westminster and caused hate and discontent. And then shortly thereafter, Lee's army on the 10th started crossing the Potomac and moving out west. And they moved out to Harper's Ferry and took Harper's Ferry. They moved out to the Loudon Heights, which is above Harper's Ferry. They moved out to Maryland Heights, and they moved on the northwest side of Harper's Ferry. And their intent was, Harper's Ferry was blocking communications for Lee's army. Lee's army was dependent on supplies that were coming by railroad up through the valley and then being transported by wagon. Well, as long as those federal troops were at Harper's Ferry, he couldn't get his supplies up north, or he was afraid that if he tried to, that Union army would attack him. So he needed to get Harper's Ferry captured to open that supply line. And so Lee split his army, which was something normally that didn't happen. And he sent part of his army to Harper's Ferry, part of his army over to Hagerstown, and the cavalry moved out of the Mount Airy area, moved west with the rest of the army. So that's pretty much, I mean, the rest of it's the Battle of South Mountain that you've all heard of, and of course Sharpsburg with Antietam. For those Union people.
That southern bit coming through again.
Sorry. There was a battle fought in Sharpsburg, what can I say? That was one of the, Gettysburg and Antietam were two of the battles that were actually fought in a town, Gettysburg and Sharpsburg. They call it Antietam because it was on the Antietam Creek. The Union calls it Antietam because it was on the Antietam Creek. But the battles were actually fought in Sharpsburg, and Antietam was fought in the town of Sharpsburg, and Gettysburg was actually fought in the town of Gettysburg. Whereas Manassas was fought outside of Manassas, or Bull Run as they call it. But most of the other battles were fought on the extremities of towns. And just got the name because that's, the closest town they were at. Of course, South Mountain is the Battle of Boonesboro, actually. Okay, that's all I've got. Any questions?
When it comes to Antietam, once a year they have a thing called the luminaries up there.
Yes.
If you haven't seen that, you need to do it. It
Oh.
is absolutely incredible. They have a bag with sand and a candle in it that's lit for every casualty up there. And you drive through the battlefield, and there are places where there are candles as far as the eye can see. It is
Very
an
moving.
interesting thing to do. It's usually, as if I understand, the first week in December.
They
or
just
something
had
like
it
that.
on
Just
Saturday.
had it.
So you can't go this year, but if you ever get a chance, it is
And it's
fabulous.
usually warm right up to the day they have it, and at night it's freezing.
Right. Go early. Get in line.
Only if you're with the Boy
Or
Scouts
go
that are
late.
camping there.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, like I said, this is just 1862, and I haven't even didn't even finish, but, I just talked about the aftermath, but 1863 has twice as much going during that time period, during the Gettysburg campaign. It's fascinating when you read some of this history, like there was a battle down at Poplar Springs where a whole company of Federal soldiers was captured in a heartbeat. They didn't even know what hit them. The Confederate cavalry came on them. But there was also troop movements through Mount Airy like crazy. And if you get the new history book here, it talks about a bunch about how one of the Union Corps marched right through Mount Airy and right down Main Street. So
Sedgwick's on.
yeah. So a lot happened here during the Civil War, and then of course in 1864 you had the second invasion of Maryland, which was when Jubal Early marched up here, and that resulted in the Battle of Monocacy Junction and Fort Stevens, Washington, D.C. His intent was to march into Washington, which unfortunately for him, Grant sent troops up in nick of time and saved Washington. But they did have a battle outside of Washington. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was at Fort Stevens during the battle, and somebody grabbed him and says, "Get out, you fool," because he was standing right up on the parapets getting shot at. So a lot of history in this area, Civil War.
So, some of the people who've been here longer than me, I'll put it that way, distinguish Ridgeville from Mount Airy. And my question is kind of along the lines that you were talking about the battle that could have happened up near the food line. Was so much depends on a source of water. Was there a spring somewhere up there in Ridgeville?
Yes.
Down by the
Plane number 4.
Okay.
railroad tracks.
Go to the light in Ridgeville, turn right, at the bottom of the hill was a spring
Okay.
on the left. I
Okay.
think they finally sealed it up. One of the reasons that Ridgeville became part of Mount Airy is because we didn't have water out there. And that actually led petition drives and all that to get Ridgeville incorporated. Because we would take milk cans down there and get water out of that spring down there, because we didn't have any water.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Yeah, there's a good stream right at the bottom of the hill there that runs along the railroad tracks.
That's, yeah.
That's, okay, but the tunnel wouldn't have been there.
No,